Imagine a moment when you can't tear your eyes away from the screen, where a president of the United States isn't sitting in the Oval Office typing familiar tweets or standing before a cheering crowd with a microphone in hand, but instead strides directly into the Supreme Court, the hallowed hall of American justice, to confront Chief Justice John Roberts face to face. No sprawling team of advisors, no pre-written speech crafted by experts, just him, a thin stack of documents under his arm, and an unflinching gaze. It's April 6, 2025, a day when America witnesses something unprecedented in its history, an unrelenting showdown between the two most powerful branches of government, broadcast live to millions. This isn't a Hollywood script or a cheap political stunt. This is Donald Trump turning a cold courtroom into a battlefield of ideas, posing the most profound question anyone living in this democracy must pause to ponder. Who truly holds power in this nation? The president elected by the people, the robed justices, or us, the ordinary citizens? With over 20 years of investigative journalism experience at major outlets like The Washington Post and The New York Times, I've seen my share of political crises shake America, from the Watergate scandal that toppled a president to the dark days after the 9/11 attacks, when the world seemed to hold its breath, to the 2008 financial collapse that left millions homeless overnight. But nothing has left me as awestruck and uneasy as this event, not because it was loud. Trump didn't shout or pound the table as he often does at rallies, but because it quietly pierced the core of a system we've always believed to be inviolable. That system is the judiciary, where black-robed figures are seen as living gods, the final guardians of the Constitution. And then, on a mild spring day, Trump walked in, no knock, no permission, and declared, "You are not kings." It all began with a deportation order, a border security policy the Trump administration deemed essential. But a federal judge, James Boasberg, dealt it a fatal blow. He blocked the order, citing a 1798 law, the Alien Enemies Act, so antiquated that even seasoned lawyers had to dust off their books to recall it. Trump didn't react with an angry social media post, as people might have expected. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He requested a public dialogue with the Supreme Court, held right in their own courtroom, calling it the National Judicial Reform Conference. No flashy press releases, no cryptic hints from just a formal email sent from the Oval Office at midnight, stamped with the White House seal, inviting Chief Justice Roberts and the other justices to attend. By 8 a.m. the next morning, America erupted. CNN labeled it a bold move, Fox News hailed it as Trump demanding accountability from the bench, and MSNBC growled that it was a political farce. But no matter where you stood, one thing was undeniable. This was the first time a president dared to step into the judiciary's domain and say, "Look at me." I still recall the feeling when I read that news in the newsroom. Phones rang incessantly, young reporters darted around with fresh printouts, and my editor, a 40-year veteran, just sat there shaking his head and whispering, "He's really doing it." Over my career, I've learned that American politics isn't always what it seems on the surface. Behind every speech, every bill, there are silent battles and backroom deals. But this time, Trump wasn't playing that game. He wanted the spotlight to shine directly on the system. No curtains, no hiding places. And when he entered that marble-lined room with two podiums set up, one bearing the presidential eagle, the other the Supreme Court's seal, I knew we were witnessing something bigger than a legal spat. This was a warning, a challenge, and perhaps a promise that the power structure we've always assumed was rock solid might not be what we think. So why does this moment matter so much? Not just because it shattered precedent, though that alone was shocking enough. In American history, presidents in the Supreme Court have kept a safe distance, communicating through dense legal briefs or rulings read in silence. But Trump tore up that rulebook. He didn't send lawyers or wait for an appeal. He stood there, eye to eye with Roberts, turning a dry legal issue into a vivid tale of power, accountability, and public trust. More than that, he awakened something modern America seemed to have forgotten, the realization that government isn't a self-running machine, but something answerable to the very people who built it, us. Get ready, because this story won't stop here. It will take you through peaks of tension as Trump hurls accusations like bombs at the judiciary, Then dip into reflective pauses as a nation asks whether its democracy truly belongs to them. From my experience, I can tell you, this isn't just an event for headlines. It's a journey for us all to explore. Trump opened the door, but what lies beyond? Step in with me, because from this moment on, you won't want to miss a second. If you felt the heavy air in that marble-lined Supreme Court chamber as Donald Trump walked in, his gaze fixed on Chief Justice John Roberts, brace yourself, because what happened next wasn't just a conversation, it was a war. After I told you how Trump turned the legal sanctum into an ideological battlefield, now we watch him land his first blow, one aimed not just at Roberts, but at the entire judicial system he believes has overstepped. With over 20 years digging through the muck of investigative journalism, I've seen politicians attack their foes plenty of times, but never has one dared stand in the Supreme Court, hoist the Declaration of Independence aloft, and claim that robed justices are quietly stealing power from the people. Join me in this moment as tension rises like a towering wave and each of Trump's words thunders like lightning in a silent sky. Picture this scene. Trump stands behind his podium, no teleprompter, no folded notes tucked in his pocket, just a slim stack of papers he sets gently on the polished wood. The room is deathly still, so quiet you can hear the breaths of reporters clicking cameras from the back. He scans the room once, his eyes sweeping over the justices perched upright in their high seats. Then begins, his voice low but sharp as a blade. When I swore to protect this nation, I didn't expect to stand here. Not to talk to foreign enemies, but to men in robes, hiding behind dignified silence. That opening wasn't a casual greeting, it was a gunshot, an uncompromising declaration of war. Then, like a gladiator entering the arena, he brandishes his first weapon, the order from Judge James Boasberg, who blocked his deportation policy with a ruling Trump calls a dust-covered legal tool, dragged out from the 18th century to serve modern outrage. I still shiver recalling that line. In my career, I've sat through hundreds of trials, pored over endless rulings that even lawyers squint at. But Trump wasn't playing the legal game here. He didn't debate the fine print of the 1798 Alien Enemies Act Boasberg cited. Instead, he turned it into a symbol of a system he claims has run amok. He held the order high, letting the light from ancient chandeliers pierce the thin paper and said, "This isn't law, it's leverage. Leverage for one unelected man to stop the will of millions who voted." The room seemed to hold its breath. The justices didn't flinch, but I caught a fleeting glance from Justice Yang, a tiny sign they weren't entirely unmoved by this assault. But Trump didn't stop there. He knew criticizing one federal judge wouldn't shake the whole system. He needed something bigger, stronger, and he found it in his vest pocket. With a slow, almost ceremonial motion, he pulled out a copy of the Declaration of Independence, opened it before everyone, and let the cameras zoom in on the reprinted handwritten lines. "This nation wasn't built to create kings," he said, his voice no longer calm but trembling with emotion. "It was built to tear them down. And if we let judges become rulers in the shadows, accountable to no one, we're not a republic anymore. We have a robed tyranny." The word tyranny exploded in the quiet space, and I swear even the most seasoned reporters paused their typing for a second to process it. This was the peak of drama, the moment Trump didn't just attack a ruling, but questioned the very legitimacy of America's judicial system. From my years watching U.S. politics, I knew this wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. Trump understood people don't care about complex legal arguments. They want to feel someone's fighting for them, against a system they've long suspected is too detached. He turned a dry immigration issue into a vivid tale of stolen power, casting judges not as constitutional guardians, but as silent betrayers. But was he right? Or was this just a performance to bolster his image with supporters? That's the question I, and maybe you, couldn't stop wrestling with as he moved to his next step. The tension in the room was so thick you could feel it on your skin. Trump's aides, like Pam Bondi and Carolyn Driscoll, stood silently behind, not daring to interrupt. They knew this was his stage and he was directing it his way. But then, like a massive wave cresting, Trump suddenly softened his tone, stepped closer to the podium, and looked straight at Roberts. "I say this with respect for your office, Chief Justice," he said, his voice now lower, almost tinged with regret. "But not for your doctrine. When the people cry for action and the courts answer with silence, that's not neutrality, it's surrender." Those words didn't boom like before, but they cut deep, slicing through the air like a thin blade. It wasn't a direct accusation, but a warning, an invitation for Roberts and the justices to face a reality Trump believed they'd dodged too long. I've seen politicians wield words to rile up crowds, but this was the first time I'd watched a president use the silence between sentences to such powerful effect. In that moment, Trump wasn't just the head of the executive branch. He was the voice of a simmering anger in America's heart, the frustration of those who feel their voices are choked by decisions made in rooms they'll never enter. But this attack, as potent as it was, carried risk. If he went too far, if he couldn't prove the system was truly failing, history might brand him a wrecker, not a reformer. And as he set the declaration back on the podium, I knew this battle was just beginning. Pause for a second and imagine you're there, in that room, your pulse quickening as Trump drops each word like a stone into a still pond. What would you think? Would you side with him, believing he's fighting for the people's power? Or would you fear he's pushing America to the edge of a constitutional crisis? Whatever you feel, one thing's certain. No one looked away from him then, and this story is far from over. We've just climbed the first peak, but more mountains lie ahead, and I'll guide you through every step. The moment Donald Trump let his final words fall onto the Supreme Court's marble floor, a chilling warning that judicial silence wasn't neutrality, but surrender. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. You remember how I took you to that dramatic peak when Trump raised the Declaration of Independence, called the justices a robed tyranny, and posed the question that shook America? Who really holds power? He dropped that ideological bomb in the legal sanctum, and now all eyes turned to Chief Justice John Roberts. The man seated at the highest bench, hands clasped tightly before him, his demeanor as steady as stone, had to respond, not through a ruling penned in private, but right here in front of Trump before cameras beaming live to millions. With 20 years of investigative journalism under my belt, I'm used to moments taut as a bowstring in American politics, but this time the silence before Roberts spoke felt like the ticking of a time bomb, making my heart, and maybe yours, beat a little faster. Picture this. Trump had just stepped back from his podium, arms crossed, eyes still locked on Roberts, as if daring him to rise and rebut. The room remained hushed, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence where you feel the pressure in the air, where everyone holds their breath, waiting for what's next. Then, with a slow, almost ritualistic motion, Roberts nudged his glasses up his nose, leaned forward, and began. His voice wasn't loud, didn't waver, carried no emotion beyond the cool calm he'd honed over decades on the bench. "Mr. President," he started, "with all due respect, I must say this institution doesn't exist to reflect the public's passions, but to restrain them." That line dropped like a cold stone into a boiling lake, tempering the fire Trump had ignited, yet widening the chasm between these two men. One a blazing torch of the executive, the other an icy wall of the judiciary. I sat there amid reporters scribbling furiously and felt the shift in the atmosphere. Trump had struck with emotion, words sharp as daggers, but Roberts countered with reason, a dry, nearly impenetrable logic. He went on, his tone even, like a law school lecture. "The courts aren't a rescue squad for stalled policies or a weapon for political urgency. We've reviewed executive actions since Marbury v. Madison in 1803. That's not rebellion, Mr. President. It's duty." He paused, locking eyes with Trump, and I swear you could have heard a pin drop in that vast chamber. The cameras panned slowly across Roberts' face. No wrinkles, no frown, just the cold confidence of a man rooted in history's firm ground. But don't think Roberts' calm dulled the drama. No, it pushed the tension to a new height in a wholly different way. For Trump, this was personal, a fight for the people's will he believed he embodied. For Roberts, it was principle, safeguarding a system he saw as the Constitution's last shield. And as these two men stared at each other, neither yielding, I sensed a wordless duel unfolding before my eyes. Trump stood firm, arms still crossed, chin slightly raised, as if to say, "You can hide behind history, but you can't hide from me." Roberts, eyes veiled behind glasses, seemed to reply, "I don't need to fight you. This system stood for over 200 years, and it'll outlast you." That was the climax here, not shouts or table pounding, but a silent clash of irreconcilable wills. I've watched heated debates in Congress, trials where lawyers roared to defend clients, but never have I seen a standoff unfold in such eerie quiet. From my experience, I spotted Roberts' tactic instantly. He refused to be dragged into Trump's emotional game. He chose to rise above, turning the president's attack into a chance to remind the nation that the Supreme Court isn't a political tool, it's a balancer, even if that angers millions. But that came at a cost. His calm, though strong in argument, felt like fuel on the fire of discontent Trump had stoked. To Trump supporters, who saw him as a warrior against the system, Roberts' words were just more proof the judiciary was out of touch, smug in a robe of untouchable power. Then, like a wave hitting its peak, the air began to ease, not because the tension vanished, but because both had said what they needed. Roberts straightened in his chair, hands clasped as before, face reverting to its blank slate. Trump, still sharp-eyed, didn't press the attack further. He stood there, letting Roberts' words hang, as if inviting America to decide whose side they were on. For me, this was a moment to breathe, a necessary pause after the storm Trump unleashed. But don't mistake it. This silence wasn't an end. It was the start of a bigger fight, where the public, not just these two men, would determine what this all meant. Looking back as a seasoned journalist, I see Roberts played a smart but risky hand. He defended the court's neutral image, but in a nation simmering with frustration, that neutrality could be misread as indifference. Trump threw down the gauntlet, and Roberts picked it up, not to fight, but to set it aside with cool courtesy. Would that quench the blaze Trump ignited, or would it only let it smolder, waiting to flare anew? As I left the courtroom that day, notebook stuffed with scrawled notes, I knew the answer wasn't here, within these four walls. It lay ahead, in the voices of millions watching, thinking, wondering, who does this system really serve? Imagine you're one of them in front of your screen, your pulse slowing after that dramatic peak. What do you think of Roberts? A constitutional guardian or a gatekeeper of an aging system? And Trump, a hero or a troublemaker? This story's not over, and I'll take you further through bigger waves still to come. Get ready, because after this lull, a new storm's brewing. When Chief Justice John Roberts straightened in his seat, hands clasped and face impassive after his calm but cutting reply, the Supreme Court chambers sank into a heavy stillness. I'd walked you through how Roberts turned Trump's fierce assault into a lecture on judicial duty, erecting an icy barrier between them. But if you thought Donald Trump would halt, letting that silence take hold, you'd be wrong. The man behind the podium with the presidential eagle isn't one to back down. With over 20 years in investigative journalism, I've learned the calmest moments often herald a greater tempest. And on April 6, 2025, Trump didn't just rekindle the fire he'd sparked. He turned it into a wildfire, spreading from the courtroom across America, drawing millions into what he called reclaiming power for the people. Join me in this second climax, where tension surges like a tsunami and the public's voice emerges as an unexpected star. Picture this. Trump stood there, eyes still fixed on Roberts, but now with a subtle shift, shoulders forward like a boxer ready for the next punch. The room stayed silent, but it was a charged hush, the kind where everyone knows something's coming. Then, with a deliberate, slow motion, Trump bent down, picking up Boasberg's order he'd once held high, the paper he'd dubbed legal leverage against the people's will. But this time, he didn't just hold it. In a moment I swear made the world stop breathing, he let it slip from his fingers to the marble floor, drifting lightly before landing with a faint sharp sound, like a pin dropping in a storm. "This isn't law," he said, his voice no longer just low but laced with restrained fury. "This is rule by judiciary." One unelected man sitting in his office typing a few lines, and suddenly thousands of border agents in McAllen stand still, letting smugglers cross. If that's not tyranny, what is? Now the room erupted, not with applause or shouts, but a wave of murmurs too big to contain from reporters and onlookers. Cameras whipped to Robert's face, and this time I caught a fleeting frown. Small, but enough to show he wasn't wholly untouched by that move. From my years observing U.S. politics, I knew Trump wasn't just speaking to those present. He was addressing millions, watching on screens from Ohio diners to Mississippi barbershops. Dropping that order wasn't just symbolic. It was a call, a message that the judiciary isn't untouchable, that robed figures aren't divine. Stepping forward, his voice boomed like thunder. If an unelected judge can stop a president from securing the border, we don't have checks and balances anymore. We have tyranny, just written in fancier font. This was the dramatic peak, the moment Trump escalated the fight to new heights. He didn't stop at one ruling or judge. He challenged the entire framework of American power, forcing everyone to face the idea that the system they trust might be betraying them. What stunned me, and I bet you too, wasn't just his words, but what happened next, beyond the courtroom's walls. As he stood there, scanning the crowd like a general eyeing his troops, something bigger ignited. In the corner, Elon Musk, of all people, pulled out his phone and typed a post on X. A courtroom just became a battlefield. Within minutes, it spread like wildfire, hitting over 2 million views before Trump even left the podium. The hashtag #VSBallot popped up, not just from Trump fans, but from independents, folks who'd never cared about politics before. I've covered social movements from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter, but I've never seen the public react this fast, this fiercely. From a factory in Bakersfield, California, a retired worker shared Musk's post with, "Finally, someone speaking for us." In Wichita Falls, Texas, a history teacher printed Trump's speech for students, and a 16-year-old said, "If my parents' votes don't matter, why do we learn about democracy?" In Flagstaff, Arizona, Marlene Cross, who hadn't voted in 2 elections, sat before her TV, fists clenched, whispering, "They can't just take our voice." This wasn't just a political moment. It was an emotional tidal wave, an awakening of those long ignored by the system. But then, like a wave cresting, the air began to settle, not because the drama faded, but because Trump knew he didn't need to yell more. He'd planted the seed, and now the public was taking the fight. He stepped back from the podium, eyes still sharp, but with a hint of satisfaction, as if he knew his act wouldn't end here. For me, this was a moment to catch my breath, a brief calm between storms. But don't be fooled, this public response wasn't fleeting. It signaled a shift bigger than Trump might have anticipated. In my career, I've seen public opinion sway policies and flip elections, but rarely have I witnessed a moment when a nation asked in unison, "Who's really running this country?" Imagine you're watching it all, your pulse racing as Trump drops that paper, then slowing as millions across America start speaking up. What would you do? Join the fight or watch from the sidelines? Whatever you choose, one thing's clear. This isn't just about Trump or Roberts anymore. It's about us, watching, thinking, shaping our future. And I promise, this climax is just the start. Stick with me, because what's coming is even bigger. After Donald Trump stepped back from the Supreme Court podium, leaving Judge Boasberg's order alone on the marble floor and sparking a public uproar, the chamber still seemed to hum with the weight of it all. I'd told you how Trump pushed the fight to a peak, dropping that paper like a declaration of war, and how millions, from retirees to high schoolers, joined in via social media with bench ballot, and how bench h.v ballot went on bench v ball and did it. It was a tidal wave of emotion, a collective awakening I'd never seen in my 20 years of investigative journalism. But as the courtroom lights dimmed, cameras panned away, and Trump exited that legal sanctum, what came next wasn't another climax. It was a pause, a meaningful stillness where America began to look inward. Join me here, where tension builds slowly through immediate fallout, explodes in a deep public shift, then eases into haunting questions no one can ignore. Imagine the scene right after the conference. Trump didn't hold a grand rally or bask in a cheering crowd, as some might have expected. Instead, he returned to the Oval Office, sank into his familiar leather chair, and left the stage to the people he'd roused. Across town, in the West Wing, Pam Bondi entered the briefing room at 8:02 a.m. the next day, arms full of thick files, her face taut with strain. "Mr. President," she said, voice quivering yet resolute, The reaction's bigger than we thought. Trump, sipping coffee, glanced up and said simply, "Good, that means they heard." That brief, cutting reply was like a pebble tossed into a lake, no instant splash, but ripples spreading wider and stronger by the second. Then, like a smoldering ember flaring up, the conference's fallout swept America at breakneck speed. Hours later, Senator Felix Morton of Florida stood on the Capitol steps, waving a paper and announcing the Judicial Accountability Act, a bill to curb judges' nationwide injunction powers, forcing them to justify rulings publicly and face tighter oversight. Cameras flashed relentlessly, and I, amid the press scrum, felt a jolt run through the crowd. This wasn't just political theater, it was proof that Trump's courtroom spark had leaped beyond his grasp, becoming a real movement. But that was nothing compared to the next surprise, Elon Musk. From his X account, he unveiled Court Light, an app letting anyone track federal judges' rulings in real time, its map glowing with red dots marking each executive policy block. Within 72 hours, it hit 5 million downloads, a figure even top campaigns envy. I still get chills recalling my first look at that app on my phone. A red dot flared in El Paso, where Boasberg's order froze border agents, another in Boston, stalling deportation flights. Names, judge bios, user comments, from praise to scathing critique, popped up clear as day. This wasn't just tech, it was a transparency revolution, pulling decisions once made in shadows into everyone's reach. Watching the download count tick up by the minute, I knew tension was rising again, not in the courtroom but in the hearts of millions holding phones, sitting at screens, asking, "Why didn't we know this sooner?" The dramatic peak came not from Trump or politicians, but from the public's mindset shift, a change I'd never seen in my career. A Gallup poll days later showed trust in the federal judiciary below 35%, the lowest in over a decade. But numbers don't tell it all. In Flagstaff, Arizona, I called Marlene Cross, a 62-year-old who'd told me she quit voting because it didn't matter. Her voice on the phone wasn't weary anymore. It trembled with feeling. When I saw him drop that paper, it felt like someone finally saw me. They can't just take our voice. In Jackson, Mississippi, I stopped by a barbershop and met Corey Bell, a former Marine. He sat quietly replaying Trump's clash with Roberts, then turned to the room and said, "That's what I've been trying to explain for years. If they can stop the president's job without answering to anyone, what do we have left?" This was when America didn't just react. They awoke. From tiny towns like Yuma, Arizona, where a history teacher handed out Trump's speech for kids to read, to big cities like Chicago, where social media debates flared, people stopped talking parties or policies, they talked power. I'd covered massive protests, but this time, there was no smoke or shouting in the streets. There was a different silence, not apathy, but deep reflection. Looking into those faces, hearing those stories, I realized Trump hadn't just cracked a wall in the Supreme Court. He'd shattered one in people's hearts, the wall of passive acceptance. But then, like a wave at its crest, the air began to settle, not because the story ended, but because it was shifting to a new phase. Trump didn't need to speak again. He'd sown the seed, and now it was sprouting in homes and conversations nationwide. For me, this was a time to pause and breathe, to look at what happened and wonder, how long will this last? Will this awakening spark real change or fade like a fever? I've seen movements rise and fall in my career, but this felt different, a quiet resolve in the eyes of folks like Marlene and Corey. They weren't just angry, they were ready to act. Imagine you're in your living room, eyes on the screen, your pulse quickening as you hear about the Judicial Accountability Act, Court Light, and tales of everyday people like you. Then you slow, asking, what does this mean for me? That's the question America's facing, and I'll keep guiding you to the answer. Because after this pause, a new chapter's dawning. And it won't be gentle. When I told you about the profound shift in public mindset, from Marlene Cross in Flagstaff rediscovering her voice, to Corey Bell in Mississippi declaring someone finally spoke for him, America seemed poised on the brink of an unprecedented awakening. The Judicial Accountability Act and Musk's Court Light had turned Trump's courtroom words into tangible action, rippling from that chamber to every corner of the nation. But if you thought Donald Trump would sit back, content to let the public carry on, you don't know this man. After that reflective pause, he didn't let the fire he'd lit burn alone. He returned, poured fuel, and made it ablaze not just to illuminate but to threaten anything he saw as a barrier to American democracy. With 20 years chasing stories, I've seen political moments alter history, but this was the first time I felt both thrilled and afraid of what's next. Join me in this final climax, where tension climbs like a volcano ready to erupt, and Trump's warning leaves a future no one can predict. Picture this. Days after the conference, Trump sat in the Oval Office, not weary from battle, but with the keen eyes of a strategist plotting his next move. On the wall where Obama's mirror once hung, he ordered a framed Declaration of Independence, not a cheap print, but a meticulously crafted version, a vivid symbol of the mission he'd taken on. Carolyn Driscoll, his press secretary, rushed in with an iPad, voice urgent. "We've got nearly 20 senators and reps wanting to co-sponsor the Judicial Accountability Act. They want to fast-track it." Trump didn't look up right away. He was flipping through handwritten notes, scrawls no one but him had touched. "Name it," he said, voice low but firm as a hammer. "People don't rally for complicated things." Carolyn nodded, and hours later, the Judicial Accountability Act was born. A pledge not just to limit judicial power, but to make judges answer to the people, something Trump believed they'd dodged too long. Tension mounted as he walked to the declaration on the wall and turned to his team, not as colleagues, but as soldiers awaiting orders. "It won't last unless we're louder than the silence," he said, his voice now not just a statement but a vow. I'd reported on Trump's speeches, often brash and chaotic, but this time there was a different focus, a chilling, almost fearsome resolve. This wasn't a call to violence or a political show. It was a promise of legal, radical, unrelenting reform. Pam Bondi stepped in, a fresh stack of papers in hand, warning, "The opposition's hitting back." Editorials call it a judicial threat. Legal experts on TV say you're setting a dangerous precedent. Trump just smirked, not a happy grin, but a confident one. "Good, let them scream. That silence has shielded them too long." This was when tension surged to a dramatic peak. Soon after, Trump faced a small group of reporters in the White House East Room, not with a roaring crowd, but in a hush so deep you could hear his breath through the mic. Holding the declaration, his voice struck like a gavel. "We've broken not the system but the illusion. If Roberts and the justices won't fix it, we will, legally, constitutionally, but totally." The word totally landed like thunder, and I, among colleagues, felt a shock ripple through the room. Camera zoomed on his face. No smile, no triumph, just a cold determination I'd never seen in him before. This wasn't empty talk. It was a warning. He wouldn't stop until the judiciary, in his view, bowed to the people's will. But the peak drama wasn't just Trump. It was the split reaction his warning unleashed. Hours later, the New York Times and the Washington Post fired off blistering editorials, branding it an unprecedented assault on judicial independence. Legal pundits on CNN and MSNBC warned Trump was paving the way for unchecked presidential power, risking a nation where the executive crushes all checks and balances. Meanwhile, Fox News and online forums hailed him as a constitutional adjuster, a leader ready to dismantle barriers they felt had stifled the people's will too long. I'd seen political divides through elections and protests, but this was like two giant waves crashing, creating a whirlpool no one knew the end of. Then, like a volcano after eruption, the air began to cool. Not because the clash ended, but because both sides had fired their heaviest shots, leaving an uneasy lull. Trump returned to his desk, flipping open his notes and jotting names, not foes, but reminders of unchecked power's cost. From my lens on events like Watergate and 9/11, I saw this wasn't just Trump's win or loss. It was a turning point. He'd shattered the myth of judicial invincibility. But at what price? Success could bring America's biggest modern reform. Failure could mark him as the one who plunged the nation deeper into constitutional crisis. Truth, as ever, lies somewhere between, and only time will tell. Imagine standing on that divide, your heart racing as Trump lifts the declaration and vows, "We'll fix it totally," then slowing as both sides roar in the void. Where do you stand? Is Trump a liberator or destroyer? For me, it's like perched atop a mountain, peering at two diverging paths, one to change, one to chaos. Leaving the East Room that day, notebook crammed with scribbles, I knew this wasn't the end. Trump opened a door, but who'll walk through? Stay with me, because after this climax, a final chapter awaits and it'll keep you riveted. When Donald Trump left the East Room, leaving a chilling vow to fix the system totally, and an America split between clashing roars, the air still vibrated with that moment's weight. I'd guided you through that final climax as Trump hung the Declaration in the Oval Office, making it a banner for his radical reform mission, while opponents and supporters collided like twin tsunamis, leaving an uncertain future dangling like an unspoken question. But if you thought the story ended there, with Trump at his desk and America bickering in chaos, you haven't seen the full picture. This isn't a play's finale, it's the prologue to a new chapter, where you, the ordinary people, take center stage. With 20 years chasing stories, I've learned the moments that truly shift history aren't in speeches or rulings, but in what follows, in the people's hearts. Join me in this close, where tension rises from the public's voice, peaks in a powerful call to act, then eases into an inspiring message you won't forget. Picture this, weeks after the conference, outside the Supreme Court under a fading Washington afternoon sun. A handwritten sign clung to the cold marble wall. No Trump 2024, or vote Republican, as you might expect. Just 8 simple, piercing words. We gave you trust, not immunity. No one knew who put it there, maybe a passerby, a quiet protester, or just a citizen leaving a mark. But standing there, amid snapping reporters and curious onlookers, I felt an undercurrent stirring. That sign wasn't just for Roberts or the justices. It was a manifesto to every elected leader, every appointed official, every suit or robe forgetting America runs not on process, but on the people who built it. Tension grew as I looked beyond, across America's streets, where this story broke free of briefing rooms and courtrooms. In a small Flagstaff, Arizona apartment, Marlene Cross, the woman who'd felt seen when Trump dropped that order, sat at her laptop, registering to vote for the first time in years. Her voice on the phone wasn't shaky with emotion anymore. It was steady, like someone reclaiming a lost piece of herself. I don't know if he's right or wrong, but I know I can't sit still anymore. In Yuma, Arizona, a history teacher stood before her class, holding Trump's speech and asking, "If you could change one thing in this system, what would it be?" A 17-year-old raised his hand. "I want the decision makers to explain to us, not just each other." Those words from everyday folks were like pebbles tossed into water, ripples forming, spreading wider than I'd dreamed. Then, like a blaze leaping from scattered sparks, the drama peaked as the people's whisper became a roar. In Jackson, Mississippi, I returned to Corey Bell's barber shop, and this time, he wasn't quiet. He stood among friends, phone blaring Trump's clash with Roberts, and shouted, "They think we'll forget, but I was in Iraq. I fought for this country, and I won't let anyone take my rights with a signature." On the streets, small groups gathered not to smash or yell, but to talk, write lawmakers, download Courtlight to track every ruling. A new Gallup poll showed judicial trust still low, but a striking stat stood out. 62% of Americans felt a duty to speak up, the highest in a decade. This wasn't fleeting anger, it was a shift, a moment when people realized if they don't seize their power, no one will. I'd reported on revolutions, from smoky Middle Eastern roads to U.S. protests. But this one unfolded in silence. Not surrender, but resolve. Standing among them, from Ohio farmers to Texas homemakers, I saw Trump may have opened the door, but they walked through. This was the story's peak, not in Trump's words or Roberts' reply, but in the actions of those who once thought their voices didn't count. Yet don't be fooled. This height came with a shadow of doubt. Would this awakening yield real change, or be snuffed out by the system it defied? Could Trump lead it, or would he be outpaced by the movement he sparked? Then, like a wave crashing, the air softened, not because answers came, but because it was time for us, the watchers, the listeners, to pause and reflect. For me, this story doesn't end in clear victory or defeat. It ends with a mirror America must face, not Obama's old Oval Office glass, but our own. I've seen history unfold through a journalist's lens, from Watergate to 9/11, but never have I watched a nation forced to ask so honestly, who are we and who do we want in charge? Trump started it, the people carried it, but the rest is yours. You reading, watching, thinking right now. Imagine facing that mirror, your heart racing, as you hear Corey's roar or see that sign by the court, then slowing as you ask, what will I do? That's my question for you, not as a reporter, but as someone who's watched America evolve over decades. If this democracy's real, it doesn't live in robes or rulings. It lives in loud, flawed, free voices. Trump may have said be louder than the silence, but now it's your call. Will you stay quiet or speak? Follow me to see what's next, because this story doesn't end. It's just begun, and you're part of it.